Madison's an interesting fellow because he is this classic Virginia slave-owning gentleman. But then he goes to college in New Jersey. He goes to the College of New Jersey, now Princeton. And it was run by a number of sort of Scott Presbyterians. And he's very much exposed to the dissenting tradition in religion and has a great respect for it. And when he goes back to Virginia, he's struck. We don't really know if he felt this way before, but he chafes at the attitudes of Virginians towards religious diversity. The Anglican Church was rather monolithic. It had a lot of connections to the government powers. There were dissenting sects around, Baptists and Presbyterians, but they were not large in any means. And he's very much engaged with their sort of subjugation in some sense. With Jefferson, he shares this view. Jefferson develops the legislation which ultimately takes effect. And it's an interesting thing because Jefferson put that on his tombstone. It's one of the three things he wanted on his tombstone was the Act for Religious Tolerance and the University of Virginia, and I forget the third. But it was Madison who got it through the Assembly. Jefferson was in France when it happened. And it was Madison who was the practical politician who could make it. And in order to build this public attitude towards it, he developed the Remonstrance on Religious Liberty, which is a very powerful statement of the need to respect and ensure freedom of conscience. And after it's enacted, he writes Jefferson and says, with great pride, I think we never again will people try to restrain human consciences. It's uncharacteristically prideful statement by Madison, but it was terribly important to him.
It didn't quite turn out that way.
Probably not.
Yeah. But so say a little bit more though. He's what was going on in Virginia at the time that he was pushing back against?
Well, there was a push led by Patrick Henry, and Patrick Henry was, of course, an immense political figure who was Madison's nemesis. At one point, Jefferson writes from France, well, the only thing we can do with Governor Henry is hope that he dies. Henry wants legislation which basically will institutionalize the connection between the state government and the church, will support the church with public revenues. And that's what Madison is trying to push against and ultimately succeeds in defeating and also getting his own, or Jefferson and his legislation adopted.
So Burt, when we were talking last week, you said it's really significant that religious freedom is right up at the top. And so say more, yeah.
It's no coincidence that if you look at the structure of Madison's First Amendment, now when I say Madison's First Amendment, David realizes, and those of you who are Madison scholars realize that that's a simplification, that Madison was the person who was carrying the lead ball here, but there were lots of people that were helping him, and the editing went on constantly, and the Senate eventually had something to say about it, and a conference committee. So it's an oversimplification to call it Madison's First Amendment. But I think it is fair to say that Madison drove the ethos of it. And it's no coincidence that it begins with religious freedom. The First Amendment has 6 ideas in it. It has no establishment of religion, free exercise of religion, free speech, free press, freedom of assembly, and freedom to petition for redress of grievances. And those are those 6 ideas in that order. No one in the history of the 42 source documents, in the history of trying to do this, to write stuff about rights, had ever put those ideas in that order. It still is the only document, including the Declaration of the Rights of Man, including all the great constitutions that have come later. It's the only document that has those 6 ideas in that order. And Madison chose to open with religion because he believed that you cannot have a democracy without recognizing the freedom of conscience of free people. That's where democracy rests, on the shoulders of a free people who are content with themselves before they can rule others. And they have to be able to live free, with a free conscience. There's a third clause, a lost clause. Madison urged that summer of 1789 to adopt a conscience clause. In addition, he wanted to open it with three clauses: no establishment, free exercise, and freedom of conscience. The freedom of conscience clause drops out during the negotiations during that summer. Ironically, of course, it comes back in because you federal judges put it back in. Thank you very much. So it does come back in. But he understood that that's where you start. You don't have a functioning democracy unless you have a person with a free conscience and freedom to think.
And he starts off with the establishment.
And he starts off with establishment. Interestingly enough, during that summer, the order occasionally flipped. Sometimes they would have free exercise first, sometimes they would have establishment first. I think he held out for having establishment first because he recognized that the single worst thing you can do to a human being in terms of dignity is to force that human being to take affirmative action that the individual, that person believes violates his deepest belief. George Orwell knew it in 1984. The way you break somebody is to get them to betray someone. If you can get them to betray someone, you own them. And Madison understood that, and that's why it starts with establishment and then goes to free exercise.